Review copy provided by NIS America. Ys is a strange series for me. Unlike most JRPGs that go back decades, I came to the IP pretty recently, all things considered, a situation I'm sure many Western fans of the genre also found themselves in. While much of my youth was spent playing Final Fantasy, Wild Arms, Vagrant Story, Breath of Fire, Suikoden, and many, many other staple franchises in this beloved genre, Ys was quietly existing outside of my wheelhouse. Still, much of this can be attributed to the franchise's lack of prevalence in the West, at a time where only some were lucky enough to appear on gamers' radars outside of Japan. Beginning life in 1987 on the PC 8801, Ys would seek to tell the tales of Adol Kristin, a young, red-headed adventurer who through intention or simple happenstance would find himself pulled into world-saving journeys and evil-vanquishing prophecies the world over, all while gaining new friends and allies along the way. While such a premise sounds formulaic for a JRPG of this era, it would be in its action-focused gameplay where Ys would set itself apart from the competition. With games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest favouring a turn-based combat system, Ys would instead opt for some form of real-time combat, even from its very first entry, where the now much beloved bump system was employed, which saw players attacking enemies automatically when running into them. Such an action focus would continue, and while the bump system has long since been retired, quick, fluid, real-time combat is the name of the game in Ys, and such elements have allowed the franchise to stand out from many of its peers. But as I mentioned earlier, Ys was a series that rarely saw the light of day outside of Japan for many years, with the first 5 entries, all initially at least, only releasing in their native country. However, such fortunes would begin to change with Ys 6, Ark of Napishtim. Initially launching on PC in Japan only in 2003, Ys 6 would see both a PS2 port in 2005 and a PSP port in 2006, both of which would be released worldwide. This trend would continue, albeit at a slow pace, and in 2010, the West would see Ys The Oath in Falcom, a remake of the third entry in the series, and Ys 7, the latest mainline entry, both released on PSP. Such events would pique the interest of players, and while the dam wouldn't break just yet, a small but loyal Ys following was starting to build outside of Japan. However, it would be the release of Ys Memories of Celceta that would really start the ball rolling. Initially a PlayStation Vita exclusive, rest in peace PlayStation Vita, we love you, Memories of Celceta would release in 2012 in Japan, 2013 in North America, and 2014 in Europe and Australia. Set in between Ys 2 and 3, Memories of Celceta would continue to iterate on Ys 7's style and tone, and would garner decent critical and commercial acclaim. In fact, it even recently saw a PS4 re-release, and once again was well received. Such events had brought Ys to a bigger audience, and begun to put it on the radar for some, but as we all know, a PlayStation Vita exclusive was never going to do dam busters, despite it being an amazing portable system, and gone too soon. But such an increase in popularity led to many of the older Ys games seeing release on Steam and other platforms in the West, with Ys 1 and 2 complete, Oath in Falcom, Ark of Napishtim, Ys 7, and Ys Origins all being made available to Western players by 2016. And so now we arrive at the most important moment for the Ys series in the West, July 21st, 2016. July 21st, 2016 would see the worldwide release of Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana, on PlayStation 4, PC, Switch, and PlayStation Vita. We love you. As the next mainline entry and the first to be made with the current-gen consoles in mind, Ys 8 would garner critical and commercial acclaim, both inside and outside of Japan. While it did have some port issues on Steam, and also would come under heavy criticism for some terrible localization work, both of which have now thankfully been fixed with patches, it would still become the fastest selling game in the series by far, having sold over 500,000 copies by the end of 2018. Relatively speaking, this was a level of success that had so far not been experienced by the Ys series, bringing in many new fans and boosting interest in sales in the older entries, which were now more readily available. And so, after a slightly longer preamble than normal, we arrive at February 2021 and the Western release of possibly the most anticipated game in the series so far, Ys 9 Monstrum Nox. Now, full disclosure, as you can probably tell already by how long this video is, I'm a fan of JRPGs and the Ys series in general, and while that will in no way affect my critique, in fact I think it probably stands to make it more thorough, it has meant that my approach here has been a little different. As mentioned at the start of the video, my review copy of Ys 9 was provided by the game's publisher, NIS America. Thanks again to them for that. Normally, the practice for most here is to complete a thorough playthrough as quickly as possible before the review embargo, and try and produce a review alongside other outlets and channels, as it stands to reason that this would be the moment where interest is highest. However, as always, I wanted to do a bit more of a deeper dive. With this in mind, I decided to wait until I'd experienced all that Ys 9 had to offer before writing this review, in order to be as learned and thorough as possible with my critique. Such practice has meant that while this review is a little later than most outlets and other channels, it will hopefully provide a much more in-depth critique. For the purposes of transparency, I can tell you that I have now beaten the game 3 times from start to finish, twice on normal and once on nightmare difficulty, maxed all character levels, gained all the best gear, found all collectibles, completed all side content, attained the platinum trophy, and alienated what few friends and loved ones I had left. Just kidding, I don't have any friends or loved ones. Now, with all that said, and with a review script that will no doubt rival most undergraduate dissertations in length, let's talk about Ys 9. So, first things first, despite its length, this will largely be a spoiler-free review. I won't discuss any intricacies of the plot of this or any other entry in the Ys series, and I will also be using gameplay footage from around the first 3 hours of the game, barring a few clips of some game progression systems that unlock after this point. Obviously, if you want to know nothing at all about the game's story or premise, then feel free to skip to the next section of this review. I'll put a timecode here, and the section should also be bookmarked below. But beyond the basic setup, I'm not going to spoil anything here. When it comes to story and narrative, Ys is a little different than some of its contemporaries. While series like Final Fantasy will reboot the entire world, lore and systems with every entry, and other franchises like Dragon Quest will have tangential links to older games, but will basically often act as an iterative remake of sorts, Ys is instead one persistent story. While this might sound like an issue for newcomers, don't worry. Barring Ys 2, which is much more of a direct follow-up to its predecessor, and Ys Origin, which digs a little deeper into the lore than most entries, these games can be played pretty much in any order, and usually exist as standalone stories and adventures where new locations and characters will be introduced for the purposes of the story being told in that particular entry. This brings me to the first positive about Ys 9's storytelling, its clear success as both a piece of a larger story and a standalone tale. More than any other entry in the series, Ys 9 seems to call back to earlier adventures, and treats series protagonist Adol as a known figure, famous for his many adventures throughout the world. In fact, such an element is one that is key to the game's story throughout, and while it never overshadows proceedings or alienates newcomers, it's nice for series fans to feel like this latest entry is a continuation of what came before. Whenever a reference to an old adventure came up, I genuinely felt like I was looking back on it alongside Adol, and such an element, while small, helped draw me into the world and play on my nostalgia for the series. The story begins with Adol and his longtime friend, companion, and confirmed best character of the series, Dogi, arriving at the prison city of Balduke. Upon arrival, Adol is immediately recognised and arrested with seemingly no reason given. He's then taken to a huge labyrinthine prison at the centre of the city. Confused and determined to get to the bottom of things, Adol decides to break out of the prison and investigate these mysterious goings-on. But in true Ys fashion, things take a turn for the strange on his way out, and the journey only gets more crazy from there. While this is all I'm willing to say about the story for fear of spoiling anything, there are several key elements that I feel will be useful to those going in, even if they are actively avoiding spoilers. First of all, as already mentioned, Ys 9 does a nice job of feeling like a standalone story and also a celebration of all that has come before, often utilising multiple choice dialogue options to allow players to confirm or deny their knowledge of previous games. While this never has any real bearing on the plot itself, it's still nice that it's been considered, and it's a fun way to give the illusion of player agency. Second, there are several mysteries presented throughout, one in particular which had me hooked, that really go a long way in keeping the player invested in the story and its outcomes. Ys 9 is a much slower game in almost all senses than its predecessors, and this is perhaps most true of its narrative. It takes its time not only to get going, but also to give you answers, which is both a blessing and a curse, depending on how it's employed and what kind of player you are. All of this culminates in the final point about the story and its slower pace that I want to discuss in this review, the overt use of dialogue-driven cutscenes. This game has a lot of cutscenes, which often just involve characters standing around and talking, and this is especially prevalent in its first half. But while that might sound dull, for me, the story, its mysteries, and the game's diverse and interesting cast of characters meant that it got away with it, at least in my first playthrough. Sure, it did sometimes get a little frustrating, and it really becomes more noticeable on a second playthrough when you're skipping them all, just how many cutscenes interrupt the action. But as long as the story grabs you, it's forgivable. If, however, the story and its characters don't interest you, and you're just here for the great combat and exploration that the series is known for, then you may struggle or become frustrated with just how stop-start Ys 9 can be. All of this makes it clear that more focus was put on story here than in other entries, and while some of the tales told in the Ys series in the past have been extremely detailed, the last few entries, particularly Memories of Salsetta and Lacrimosa of Dana, felt more like side stories that existed as a backdrop for the game's mechanics to be hung on. Ys 9 Monstrum Nox is different. It very clearly has a story to tell, and that brings with it both pluses and minuses. While the series' combat and exploration focus is present later in the game, it takes a while to get there, and it's definitely not as big a part of the game when compared to previous entries. It feels emblematic of many of the game's other qualities and flaws, which we'll get to, but when all is said and done, Monstrum Nox tells one of the best stories in the franchise's long history, even if it does tell it a little too slowly on occasion. Okay, so let's talk about structure first. In the past, Ys games have generally provided a relatively large amount of freedom of exploration within areas that expand periodically throughout the game, such as the Isle of Serin from Ys 8, and so on. The normal run of business is to run around uncovering a section of the map and killing enemies until you are gifted the ability to gain access to a new area where you will then rinse and repeat this. Ys 9 sort of does this. Sort of. Okay, let me explain. The entirety of Ys 9 takes place in the city of Balduq and its surrounding areas. While in terms of surface area, the amount of explorable locations is on par with other entries in the series, the difference here is that a very large portion of this explorable area is inside the city walls. This in turn means that wild enemies are not roaming around these areas, and that fights are less frequent for much of the game's non-dungeon sections. Such design decisions place Ys 9 in a more pseudo-open world position, with much of the game taking place in just one city. However, such a structure also brings elements that are sure to divide. The general gameplay loop in Ys 9 works like this. You will only have access to one area of the city at first. In order to gain access to the next area and progress the story, you will need 100 of a currency named Nox. Nox is gained in two ways. The first is to trigger a small, and I mean very small, like 3 to 5 enemies small, battle, which can be triggered from points that respawn around the city. Problem is, these only reward about 2 to 5 Nox points, which means you'll have to trigger between 20 to 50 of them to progress. Also, this can take a long time, as when and how these battles respawn seems to be random. The second and more proficient way to gain Nox is to complete side quests, many of which will become available at the start and throughout each of the game's 9 chapters. Completing one of these side quests will reward between 20 to 50 Nox points. And to be fair, there's a pretty decent variety in both writing and completion criteria for these. I mean, this isn't The Witcher 3 or anything, but most tasks at least avoid the common pitfall of just being mindless fetch quests. Once you've gained 100 Nox, a portal will open up at the blocked section of the city, which, upon entry, will take you to what's known as a miasma vortex. Inside, you will have to partake in either a tower defense style wave-based Protect the Crystal game, where enemies and eventually a boss spawn in waves and try and destroy a crystal, which you and your allies must protect, or a destroy all the crystals mode, in which you are tasked with, you guessed it, destroying all the crystals before the time runs out in an instanced area. Upon successful completion of each miasma vortex, you are given a rating, and the barrier to the next part of the city unlocks. Generally, there is one portal that must be unlocked to progress, and one optional portal to explore more of the city once per chapter. It's also worth noting that any banked Nox points cannot be carried over to the following chapter, meaning you will have to start from 0 Nox each time. What all of this means is that the game is essentially all but forcing the player to do a certain amount of side quests in order to progress. Now, I know what you're thinking, and this is not an Anthem situation, where such methods were clearly employed only to pad out the game's runtime. In fact, I would say for the most part, many of the side quests are worth doing here, and serve to really expand the game's plot and characters in meaningful ways. However, despite this, they feel like maybe they shouldn't be side quests if you have to complete them in order to progress, right? Right? Also, I feel like players who are only interested in following the game's main path will inevitably find this frustrating. So, on top of the already discussed Nox currency and miasma vortex elements, Ys 9 also has a bunch of other systems going on that are worth talking about. Early in the story, Adol and friends establish a base of operations. From here, you can accept side quests from a quest board, speak to allies and establish closer connections with them so they aid you in the aforementioned miasma vortex missions, chat with Dogi because he's awesome, craft gear, trade items, and so on, with new systems and features being added as you meet new characters and allies throughout the game's chapters. You're also able to replay any miasma vortex to try and get a higher grade, and even cook up some stat boosting food Monster Hunter style. None of this is particularly deep or complicated. It's not Fire Emblem Awakening or Persona levels of social interaction, and it's not Minecraft. Wait, no, I need a cooler reference. Subnautica, maybe? No, it's not current enough. Valheim. Let's go with Valheim. That's what all the kids are playing nowadays with their music and their Instagrams and their Fortnite. It's not Valheim levels of in-depth, material-driven crafting, but it's nevertheless decent and serviceable, allowing Ys to flourish in other areas, like its combat. More on that in a sec. If I did have a criticism to level at this element of the game at all though, it would be that, much like almost all aspects of Ys 9, it takes time to get going. As an example, you don't even get access to the basic features of your home base until around Chapter 3, and even then, you'll be waiting a while before all of its myriad of features open up to you. I understand not dumping too many systems on the player at once, but there's nothing here that's particularly complicated, so it may have been more advisable to give the player a little more a little earlier. Still, such criticisms are minor, and align with Ys 9's clear intention to go at its own pace, even if it can be a little slow for some. But too slow or not, as I said before, all of this is in service of one element that Ys rarely fails at. It's combat. So let's talk about the leveling and skill systems first. 3 characters can be placed in your party at any time, and can be switched out pretty much whenever you want, as long as you're not mid-fight or mid-cutscene. Whilst fighting, you can also change the character you're using at any time, with a simple press of the circle button, allowing for you to switch things up on the fly. Characters level up and gain new skills through experience from killing enemies, as per most RPGs. Pro tip here though, some skills are also attained through items, which are found in chests throughout the world. All in all, there are 10 unlockable skills for each character, 4 of which can be set as active at any time and assigned to the face buttons. Skills are then leveled up and made more powerful through number of uses, with some taking longer than others to reach new levels of power. While all of this is basic stuff for most RPG or JRPG players, it is worth noting that there's not really much of a tutorial when it comes to the skills system at least. A minor criticism, but for the sake of a few tooltips, this could have been easily avoided and made everything a little clearer. Characters also have standard weapon, armor, and accessory slots that can augment stats and allow for greater regular damage and stun damage, a system that allows you to temporarily incapacitate an opponent and make them more vulnerable to attack. This feature can be particularly useful in the game's many boss battles, and can turn the tide when utilised correctly. Almost every encounter in Ys 9 is a joy to play, with combat feeling fast, fluid, and varied, and eliciting just the right amount of challenge, regardless of the situation or enemy. Every playable character feels distinct and fun to use, with no single weak link to speak of. Fancy an all-rounder with great damage? Use the Crimson King. How about a glass cannon? Use Renegade. Or what about a powerhouse who can stomp her opposition before they even have a chance to act? Raging Bull is here for you. Such diversity means that play is never dull, and I genuinely found myself not knowing who to have in my party at any one time, due to having such a blast playing as any of the game's heroes. Although in one definitive minus point on this, I can confirm that Dogi is again not playable, making it at least 3 games since the last time we could use him in battle. Sad times. Also, it's worth noting that even if party members are not in your main usage pool, they still gain experience from every battle and boss fought, albeit at a reduced rate. This in turn means catching them up is never too much of a chore when you want to switch things up. All of these systems coalesce to form what is essentially an iterated version of Ys 8's combat, with many of that game's key qualities intact. In short, any fan or player who is familiar with Lacrimosa of Dana will feel right at home here. But such fun systems can sometimes highlight the game's aforementioned pacing issues. The stop-start nature and the way that the game delivers its narrative, coupled with the structure of the game keeping things very linear and confined for its first two-thirds, especially when it comes to exploration and open spaces, means that you will often be drawn into battle only for it to end and there to be another bunch of slow, exposition-heavy cutscenes. While it's by far not enough to ruin things, especially if the story resonates with you, as much as it did with me, it's still clear that Monstrum Nox, and Ys in general, is at its best when you're exploring and killing shit. And while Ys 9 has both of these elements, and arguably does them better than any previous entry, they are in lesser supply, and come later in the game. So, I did an impressions video for Ys 9 a while back. In that video, I said that I was a little disappointed with the lack of progression in visual fidelity when compared to the last entry in the series. As expected, given the game has been out for some time in Japan, the full release has not improved this at all, and Ys 9 looks in many ways the same, if not worse in some cases, than its predecessor. Now, don't get me wrong, gameplay is king with Ys, and I understand that Falcom is not the biggest or most financially backed developer in the world, or even in Japan, but I really hoped that we might see some improvements in this department. As it stands, textures are often muddy, pop-in is pretty bad, and animations feel dated. It also doesn't help that Balduke itself is a little more of a muted looking location than some places we've visited in Adol's other adventures, with greys and blues featuring prominently and little to appear striking or piercing in the game's colour palette. I mean, I understand that there are plans to release Monstrum Nox on significantly less powerful hardware in the form of the Nintendo Switch version later in the year. Hoping to do a follow-up video for that, by the way. But there are many similarly budgeted titles, even on Nintendo's little console that look significantly better than Ys 9. However, having said all of this, one thing that does stand up and goes a long way towards making up for some of the game's visual shortcomings is the art direction. Character and building designs are stellar here. Portrait and costume designs help convey facets of the cast in ways that dialogue never could, and the city of Balduke and its surrounding areas are brimming with Gothic influence in their architecture. Massive cathedrals, ornate stairways, and cobbled streets all add to the aesthetic, and such qualities are only more potent inside the game's many dungeons and prison sections. In short, despite its lack of modern levels of fidelity, Ys 9's visuals achieve what they set out to accomplish and evoke a tone clearly inspired by the Gothic literature of the late 1800s, all of which feels appropriate and in keeping with the darker and less jovial tale being told. Sound-wise, Ys 9 is solid fare for the most part, with decent voice acting barring one character whose voice dialogue I had to skip because it was the most obnoxious thing I'd heard since Charlotte in the Secret of Mana remake, but the less said about that the better. Other than this though, pretty much solid, if not outstanding work all round. One thing that is a little strange though, is that voice dialogue is inconsistently used here, which is weird and slightly off-putting. Essentially, with many of the game's cutscenes, things will start off being voice acted, and then halfway through will suddenly switch to just text, with no one being voiced anymore at all. Like, this happens mid-cutscene. Occasionally things would get even worse, when it would switch back and characters would start being voiced again after a period of text-only chatter. I thought I was losing my fucking mind. Maybe I am losing my mind. I mean, who am I even talking to? Anyway, this really needed a little more consistency in my opinion. Like, I don't mind if nothing is voiced, I often prefer that, or if everything is voiced, or even if only certain important scenes are voiced, but having half a cutscene voiced and half of it not is just kind of weird and off-putting. However, one area where Ys 9 makes pretty much no mistakes is in its soundtrack. While this won't be surprising to fans of the series, who have no doubt come to expect a certain standard when it comes to Ys's music, I can tell you pretty categorically that this element doesn't disappoint with Ys 9. A combination of more gothic, slower tracks for ambience and the usual rockier combat jams all create tone and atmosphere at just the right moments and never detract from the scene at hand. In short, this is good shit. We'll start with bugs here, as that will definitely be the shorter section. In all my 80 hours or so with Ys 9, I only experienced one bug. Occasionally, when fast travelling between locations, the game would sometimes, albeit rarely, crash out completely. While it sounds bad, it only happened to me like 5 times in total, and was more prevalent at one particular section when I was leaving a dungeon to return to the main city. Now, it's worth noting that all but one of these occurrences were before the game's day 1 patch, which seems to have improved things exponentially. But just in case, I would recommend saving often, a measure that is thankfully easy to take given that Monstrum Nox allows you to save at any point when not in combat or a cutscene. Also, I played this game a lot, so I'm certain this sounds worse than it is, especially given how stable the game was, even before patching, in all other areas, with no bugs to be found anywhere. Finally, it's worth noting that none of the aforementioned crashes occurred during my first playthrough, and were instead experienced when I was fast travelling a lot for the 100% cleanup on my second and third playthroughs. When it comes to replay value, there's plenty on offer here, although with some caveats. Essentially, upon completion, Ys 9 offers a New Game Plus mode, which allows for character progression and various other elements to be carried over to a new game. On top of this, completion will also unlock a time attack and boss rush mode. Such modes bring with them positives and negatives. For example, New Game Plus allows you to choose a higher difficulty, which is great as you can take on a tougher challenge with the characters you spent the entire game leveling up. However, once again, due to the game's cutscene heavy nature, especially in its first 2/3, a second playthrough really does serve to highlight Monstrum Nox's pacing flaws. Essentially, once you've already experienced the story and just want to take on the game's challenges again at a higher difficulty, you realise just how much of the game is exposition. So much of your time is spent running between locations and skipping cutscenes in New Game Plus, which is a real shame, but is unfortunately an unavoidable byproduct of such a heavy story focus. Similarly, the time attack and boss rush mode also has a significant issue which holds it back for me. Essentially, when fighting each boss, or taking them all on in a row, the game sets your character level, gear and items before each fight for you, taking any preparation out of the player's hands. This changes the dynamic between the player and the game, and makes the challenge one which, when completed, offers little reason to revisit. Imagine if these were all higher level versions of the bosses you fought already, and you were able to load up your characters, gear and items from the main game to take them on. You could do prep, farm and even level up to overcome those challenges. As it stands now, everyone who plays this mode has the same experience, and so once it's beaten, the dynamism is gone. To be fair, all the challenges can be taken on at different difficulty levels, but as the structure is the same as before, I can't help but feel like this is a bit of a missed opportunity. What could have been a great post-game addition is instead something I played through once and have little to no cause to return to, which is a shame. While a lot of this might sound critical, once again I think the pros outweigh the cons here, with a single playthrough coming to at least 30 hours, if not more, depending on how much of the side content you engage with. Moreover, while skipping cutscenes and feeling frustrated by the game's structure once its narrative mysteries were solved was an issue in New Game Plus, I nevertheless enjoyed all 3 of my playthroughs enough for it to never become a chore or ruin the positive elements on display. And so we finally arrive at the summation of the aforementioned elements, and also the part when I finally tell you if I think Ys 9 is worth your time. In short, yeah, I think it is. It's got some very tangible problems, especially with pacing and aesthetics. It's not perfect by any means, and it stumbles more than once, but regardless of all this, the common theme here is that the pros far outweigh the cons. Its story is both an interesting and engaging diversion from the normal Ys fare, and a great celebration of the series' past. Its characters are diverse and engaging, and its combat is addictive and extremely fun. The gothic tone and slower pace may not be what many fans were expecting, but in the end, everything coalesces to form an interesting, darker, and more introspective tale, which places a higher focus on narrative than many recent games in the series. Is it the best Ys game? Not for me, but that doesn't mean it's not a great time. If you're looking for a fun, engaging, action-focused JRPG with great combat and an interesting story, look no further than Ys 9 Monstrum Nox. Just make Dogi playable next time, Falcom. Thanks for watching everyone and making it to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you didn't, then feel free to leave a dislike. I won't be offended. It's not like I'll cry myself to sleep or anything. Also, consider subscribing and ringing the bell for more content. Finally, please share this video if you can, and maybe leave a comment. It all helps the channel and community grow. Thanks again for watching, and stay safe out there.